Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Bufnagle the podcast, where we explore entertaining and enlightening discussions of the adventure of life and all things good. From science and technology to history and philosophy to leadership and success. We hope to give you a better understanding of the world and skills for everyone to pursue their own adventure.
Hey everybody, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Bufnagle Podcast, where we talk about all things good in the pursuit of the adventure of life. I'm super excited because I'm back doing co-host duties with Rafe, and we have a special guest tonight. So, Rafe, if you can do us the honors and introduce who our big brain smarthead is this evening.
Well, I'm going to do that as soon as you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to thank these world's greatest listeners that we have. We have the best listeners because they have made us a global top 10% podcast. As usual, you can reach us at bufnagle@bufnagle.com. Remember to share the love, share the buff, give us a 5-star review, subscribe, hit a like, hit a smiley star, hit us a brownie, whatever it is that you do to tell people that we are here and we are doing the job we were made to do. Tell a friend to listen and you will get a free episode tonight. Harry with us is one of the Buff's favorite guests, one of the best big brain smart heads we've had on ever. None other than America's favorite rocket scientist, Bob Luzenski. Bob, how are you?
I'm doing great, Rafe, and I'm happy to be back here again on the Buff.
So the reason we have you on here, Bob, is to always talk about these great things that we talk about, namely rockets, space, and anything related to rockets and space.
Yes, big rockets especially.
So tell us, Bob, what's the current status of the space of, I guess I'll call it the new space race, the goal to get to the moon and then to Mars and on. In November, we had a launch of Starship Super Heavy, right? And it went better than the first one, but it was not without mishap at the end. And you have some information on that and how things are going. So where do you want to start us off?
Well, yeah, we can start with the Starship update. We talked about Starship before. We did talk, I think, shortly after the second flight of the Starship Super Heavy, which is SpaceX's very large new rocket that they're developing, and the flight was in November 18th last year. And it was, as you said, it was partially successful. It did way better than the first flight, which was in April of last year. And it launched. The first stage, the Super Heavy first stage, worked basically flawlessly through staging, which was essentially SpaceX's goal to get through staging and have that work. They had a new staging between the first and second flight. They changed the staging method, and it worked flawlessly, which I find impressive and amazing.
Wasn't that called like live staging or something?
Hot staging.
Hot staging.
Hot staging.
But back to ground level, they didn't destroy the pad on launch. Is that right?
Yes. The other thing that was really good about the second flight was, as some of you may recall from the first flight dug a big hole underneath the launch pad, and they had to fix that. Yes, it was quite amazing.
This was also the same flight that all 36 all 36 engines successfully were nominal all at the same time. Everything worked.
33, but yes, the second flight they all worked well, whereas the first flight they lost at least 3 more than they needed to keep. So it didn't end well, but ended in tumbling and then breaking up. But the
most good relationships.
Yeah, well, don't get me started on that. Anyways, it went really well. First stage flew great. The hot staging worked, which basically involves igniting the engines for the second stage before the two stages separate. And they had added an actual section up at the top of the first stage so that the exhaust plumes from the second stage engines would go away, through this vented section, and it made for an amazing. It was visually stunning when it happened.
So there's a lower stage which is firing, and then there's this second stage that sits above it, and there's a vented, I'll call it a vented ring
Yes.
of right that allows.
Yeah.
So is okay. So I understand that as soon as you turn off the first stage, it starts. I mean, it starts to fall. It's not being propelled anymore against gravity. But how quickly isn't that supposed to be like essentially instantaneous? As soon as the second stage lights, it should separate, or how?
Well, the way the hot staging worked was they actually continued to run some of the first stage engines. They shut down, and the video was really interesting because you could see that they shut down the first stage engines, all 33. They didn't shut down all 33. They shut down a bunch of them in sequences, and it was neat to watch. And then, of course, the there was less thrust from them than there was from the upper stage engines, and that's how the upper stage pulled away.
It just pulls away. Then does it snap? Does it snap a belt, or is there like a zip tie that comes off?
I don't know
or
the exact details, but
it's actually held together by duct tape.
I'm sure it might be very special SpaceX duct tape. You never know.
It could be.
Okay.
So anyways, that worked really well. And actually the Starship upper stage flew really well. And up until about 8 minutes into the flight, which was within 30 seconds of when it was going to be done with the powered flight. And that's when it had a rapid unscheduled disassembly, or RUD, as we like to call it in the business.
But back in the day when we recorded the last episode on this,
yes,
we didn't know exactly what had caused that RUD.
But
true. Recently that news has come out.
Yes, Elon Musk did an update video that he released. He did a talk to the SpaceX employees, and then that was subsequently released. And one of the things that he talked about in that was the cause of the second stage, the Starship failure. And it's an interesting one because it essentially was something they did for this test flight that under normal circumstances wasn't necessary. And it actually resulted in the failure, where if they hadn't done it, it probably very likely would not have failed.
So what then was the purpose of actually putting in this secondary thing that was unnecessary? It's like putting in an appendix in a person.
Well, what it was because they weren't carrying a payload on this flight, and they had loaded the propellants as they would a normal flight, they had extra liquid oxygen in the upper stage that wouldn't be there under normal circumstances. And so what they did was, and they did it intentionally, was to vent that liquid oxygen during the powered flight. As it turned out, that really wasn't a good idea. I mean, it's easy to see in hindsight. You've got this flamey thing down at the bottom where the engines are burning, and you're releasing liquid oxygen, venting oxygen out the side, which that's 2/3 of the fire triangle, and just about you get enough oxygen, just about anything will burn, and did apparently. So that caused the failure.
So they had extra LOX, right?
Liquid oxygen.
They had extra liquid oxygen at that point in the flight, and they normally would not have had that because a payload would have weighed more and used more of it up.
Yeah, they would have been using it out.
Okay, yes. And there was not extra. What's oxygen is the oxygen? Is it methane?
The only part I heard about was the liquid oxygen, and I had the same question issue. What about the fuel? Right, which is liquid methane, and I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, that's fair.
I didn't see anything on that.
Okay, so they threw some extra oxygen out there,
and bad things happened.
All right.
So it's the old joke about doctor, it hurts when I do this, and the doctor says, well, don't do that.
Don't do that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So presumably they won't do that again.
So what you're really telling me is make sure that your thrust to weight ratio is properly accounted for the amount of payload that you have.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So that happened, and now they're preparing for the third flight of the Starship Super Heavy, and at one point a few weeks ago. They were looking at a mid-February, but we're here in early mid-February, and they're still not quite there. Although I believe they were rolling out today. They were rolling out the as we record this. Even I think they were rolling out the booster for the super heavy booster for this next flight. So they're getting there.
So, Bob, for all of us listeners out there who haven't been up to speed with Artemis and with Starship and everything and all the heavies, the rockets, and everything else, can you give us a basic, I guess, schedule of events from where we are now, right? Starship 2 just kind of had a rud to where Elon Musk wants to be for landing on Mars, because we've all heard that's his main goal. So what does our schedule and timeline look like?
It's going to be a while.
It's going to be a while. All right.
Next year, surprise.
No, but that's a really good question, Harry, and it does lead into the discussion about the Artemis missions, because really SpaceX is working on this Starship Super Heavy booster because they want to do more than just launch other people's satellites into Earth orbit. SpaceX has a stated goal of going to Mars, and so a big rocket like this is needed to do that. And we have talked about that before, but I don't think that you were here for any of those discussions. But so what? There's a whole bunch of things that need to happen before we're talking about sending humans to Mars. In terms of technology development of the rockets. And that's what I'm going to stick to, because that's the question you asked. So SpaceX is under contract with NASA to support the Artemis moon landings that NASA is intending to do. Mm-hmm. And they are working towards that with the Starship development and these test flights. In fact, the very next test flight, the third flight that could come as soon as within the next month or so, maybe mid-March to end of March, hopefully, which means they're picking up the pace, which is a good thing. As things start to go better and the flights are more successful, there'll be less time in between flights. They actually hope to do as many as I've read 8 to 10 flights this total by the end of this year. So that would be a significant increase in pace. But for the Artemis flights for NASA, SpaceX is under contract to provide a lunar lander version of Starship, the upper stage, that will carry astronauts from lunar orbit down to the moon. Well, to get to being able to do that, there's a whole bunch of things SpaceX needs to demonstrate on the way, including being able to transfer cryogenic liquid propellants like liquid oxygen and liquid methane from one vehicle to another. Because in order for the Starship lunar lander to leave Earth orbit, go to the moon, pick up astronauts, land on the moon, then lift off from the moon and deliver those astronauts back to their spaceship to come home, they need more fuel than they're going to have once they get the lunar lander into Earth orbit. And so go ahead.
This is all great. Now I've been practicing a lot because I've been playing a lot of Kerbal Space Program. And
excellent. That's a great game.
Makes me a pro. So, because at least I have an infinite number of Kerbals at my expense.
Yes, you do. And you don't mind very much if you lose one or two.
No, as long as Jebediah stays alive.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Right. So what makes it so difficult now with going to the lunar surface, getting the fuel to return to lunar orbit, to escape lunar orbit, escape the gravity well of the moon, to return to Earth, right? Because we've done it in the 60s. What makes it so difficult now?
And we did it in
the 70s a bit too.
Well, yes, the 60s and early 70s with Apollo. And that was that was a big push where money was no object, and we developed very quickly a big rocket that was very expensive to fly, and even at the time, and everything was only usable once. So we would start with a 363 foot tall Apollo Saturn V. And
the one behind your head right there.
Yes,
there
the one up here on the bookshelf.
Yes, exactly. And we'd only end up with that tiny little cone at the top, the Apollo command module, when we were done with all that. And that could not be reused. So that was a fairly unsustainable way to do it. And it was done with the absolute, I mean, the thing that amazes me to this day, I mean, I grew up with Apollo. I grew up with Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, the early manned space flight. That's what
I learned. I learned of the Greek gods not through studying mythology, but from the space program.
For the space program. But I grew up with that stuff, and it was just, they were doing this. And what I know now, having gone back and studied the technology from then, and and what I learned when I went to university, and what I've done in my career, it is astounding what they did with what they had. It's like they were literally they did it the earliest time it was actually physically possible to do. And we did it, with, this tiny little spacecraft, and the tiny little lunar lander that was just barely light enough to, it was truly amazing that they did this. Okay.
Right.
And they did it successfully, and did it 6 times. And so yes, we did it back then. And then we stopped doing it because it was way too expensive. And it wasn't about going to the moon. It was basically a rocket size contest. And that's how I'm going to say that.
Yeah.
There we go.
So you're saying the parameters have changed now, right? Because now economics are part of it, and there's reusability.
NASA doesn't have a blank check.
It doesn't have like 20% of the budget or whatever it was.
It was a huge, yes. It was I think it was 4 to 5%, something like that. I mean, they get maybe 0.5% of the U.S. Budget now, and they have to spread that over multiple things, including the space station. They can't just, spend it on going to the moon. And so this is different. They're trying to do this commercially as much as possible. For example, the spacesuits, they're hiring, instead of the traditional contracting, they're hiring a company to provide a service, spacesuits for walking on the moon. Now, how that's going to work, I don't really understand. Whether it'll be less expensive or not, that remains to be seen. But that's how they're doing it. And with space for the lunar lander, they basically contracted with SpaceX, and then also for some of the later missions, they've contacted with Blue Origin, and who's also developing a lunar lander. And both of these lunar landers, that basically NASA says, I want a lunar lander so that my astronauts can land on the moon. And how much is it going to cost? And SpaceX came back with the lowest bid, and they signed him up with the contract. And then later, because Blue Origin wasn't happy that it was sole sourced to SpaceX, they also ended up getting a contract. And so now we're going to have 2 lunar landers. We have 2 lunar landers under development. And but for SpaceX, they're doing this in a sustainable way, and it involves, rather than just throwing everything away, the Starship Super Heavy is supposed to be a fully reusable thing. They're developing it as a fully reusable system.
Didn't I read that I read that they are reusing things more? I think it was the article you sent me, Bob. They're using previous rockets more times than they had originally planned.
Well,
Is that
I think that what you're talking about is what they're doing with the Falcon 9 rocket,
right?
which is amazing as well. And people in the industry thought it couldn't be done, or if it could be done, it couldn't be done economically. But SpaceX has proven that all completely wrong. They basically they're flying booster rockets, and they're sending them up, pushing a second stage into orbit, pushing a second stage up, and then the second stage continues and puts the payload into orbit. First stage turns around, comes back down. They refurbish it a little bit and put it back on a launch pad, lather, rinse, repeat. Do it again. They originally thought they could do it. They could reuse a booster 10 times. And now they're looking at 20 to 40 times. They've got one that they've flown 20-ish times, and they think they can fly them 40 times a piece. And so now, SpaceX flew almost 100 flights last year. Incredible number.
I did not know it was that many.
And this year they're pushing for 150. So it's incredible.
Are they all launching from their SpaceX headquarters there in Texas, or are they?
The Starbase, as it's called,
right.
In Texas, is where the Starship Super Heavy factory is, and it's where the development launches are. They ultimately are also going to launch, and I expect the Artemis flights will launch from the Cape. They put the launch pad they were developing there on hold until they got further along at Starbase in Texas, but that's coming along, and I would expect this year to start to see that pick up again. But so the next flight of Starship Super Heavy, they're working to get their launch license with the FAA. They're going to do a full orbit this time, whereas the previous two, they were planning only to do suborbital, just basically go around once. Now they're going to do a full orbital, and then so they can do a deorbit burn on orbit, so they can actually fire the engines on orbit. So that's coming. They also are going to try out their new payload bay doors. They have these Starship Starlink satellites that they're launching for internet communication on Earth, and they're flat. They're kind of nice and flat, and so this payload deployment mechanism has been likened to a Pez dispenser, and it's going to just push them out the side. So they're
eventually somebody's going to pay for the advertising to be the head on top of it. Next thing you know, Lucasfilm is coming in with a Darth Vader. Oh, whoomp.
It's only a matter of time, Harry. So, and so they're going to be testing parts of that. And then the other thing they're going to do as part of a NASA technology development contract related to Artemis is they're going to be doing a propellant transfer test on this next flight. So assuming they get to orbit, they're going to do a propellant transfer within the Starship itself. There's two different tanks, and they're going to test that.
Now, okay, so I don't remember if this happened with Apollo, and I think it maybe kind of did, certainly with the fire in the capsule, but like there's a plan, and you kind of laid it out. They're going to do this next, and then they're going to demonstrate they can do this next, and then they're going to demonstrate they can do that. There's this sequencing of things, and they get further. And the assumption is that once, okay, we've shown we can do that, check, and then and I know that's not that. It doesn't leave their imagination. I'm sure people are still worried about that sort of thing until they can until they get. But like, how do you? I guess this looks to me different than testing that I would do as a statistician. Okay, so
I was going to say this doesn't look right to you as a statistics guy, and it shouldn't look right to you as a statistics guy. What's interesting about Artemis, and this is actually a topic I did want to discuss. So the Artemis 2, so Artemis 1, which was an uncrewed flight, flew in December of 2022. It's been a little over a year. It was predominantly successful. It flew around the moon. It entered this weird distant retrograde lunar orbit that they're going to use for the Artemis landing missions, and they and it largely went okay. But they
but that
had
doesn't mean
items.
That doesn't mean it always works, right? I mean, that's the thing that gets to me. It's like, shouldn't we do this a bunch of times to just, to make sure we can do it again? Right?
Yes, I'm with you. Okay. So here's the thing. So in Apollo, there was a buildup of missions to get to the lunar landing. But even this isn't going to satisfy you as a statistician, because basically they did one Earth orbit. They did a couple uncrewed, I guess at that point, missions that tested different parts of the spacecraft, and then they flew a Earth orbital mission with crew, Apollo 7, that basically ran the entire duration of the longest lunar landing they were planning, which was 14 days. So Apollo 7 did the full length of time, and all they did they were in lunar orbit, and every so often they did a TV thing with their black and white TV camera, and you got to watch it. Me as a young guy got to watch it on TV, and then they caught colds and they were very unhappy, and then we jumped right to Apollo 8 because the lunar module wasn't ready. Apollo 8 flew to the moon, and not only flew to the moon, it went into orbit around the moon. And without a lunar module, okay, which when you see what happened on Apollo 13 was actually a very
risky,
bold move. Okay. So they did that. Then Apollo 9, because the lunar module was ready for Apollo 9 a few months later, they flew that in Earth orbit. So that was the Earth orbit test that was actually supposed to happen before we went to the moon. And that went really well. Then Apollo 10 did the dress rehearsal once and went as low as they went all the way to the point of igniting the lunar module engines to start the landing. And that's the only thing they didn't do. And then they came back. And then Apollo 11 did the landing. So yeah,
but every single time you're doing those things, you're testing all of the previous things. So you're getting more and more practice, right? It's like we know how to get to orbit now.
Yes,
right?
And
so
they're adding...
set up the rocket, get enough delta V and go around.
What if in that... Okay, so here's what's interesting to me about the difference between, I guess I'll call it science and engineering, because I don't think they're the same thing. I mean, they use components of each other, but
really?
They're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing? Oh my goodness, I'm shocked.
What
this is my shocked face.
Oh, stop it. Okay, so from the science perspective, from the data and science perspective, okay, so in order to demonstrate that you have a process that you understand, okay, you need, first of all, you need a scientific, or I guess I'll call it an engineering theory. Okay, so you have a theory. You're like, okay, I have oxygen and I have hydrogen. If I mix them together with a flame, I'm going to do this. I'm going to, right? So you have this theory that does this. And if I make the nozzle narrow like this and expand like this, the gas should, and you put all these pieces together and you come up with this, well, this is what should happen, right? Right. And then, but that's the one thing you need is scientific theory. The second thing you need is empirical evidence, right? Which is like, okay, this is what we did this, we did what we thought we did. We lit the rocket and it went up. Okay. That's great. Right. And the third thing is refutation of other sources of explanation. It's like, well, maybe it went up there because, the moon was going over, or there was a tide, or, you throw all those things out.
Windy.
Right. Well, something like that. But from a science perspective, a lot of times that theory and those data are fraught with lots of variation, right? And therefore you need more data and you need a better theory. But in the engineering world, you're like, well, look, it's a wing and air goes over it. What is it's not going to not fly today if it flew yesterday. Right? But what will they do? What will they do if, when they're doing that sequence, they find out that third piece of the 12-piece sequence fails on the 13th? You're like, suddenly we have to go back and what's the process for that?
I understand what you're saying. And as an engineer rather than a scientist, I can say that we do things to mitigate the risk.
It'll
And
buff.
what one of them is to um, one of them is to uh, provide redundancy. Okay, I think many of us as young people learned what the word redundancy meant watching the NASA do their thing back in the 60s. Okay, I know what that word. The first time I came across the word redundancy was in the context of you know components and systems on the spacecraft in order to make sure that they had a working vehicle across the entire mission. And the other thing is you design to margins. So for example, space flight, the margin they tend to use is 1.4. So 40% above, they design for it to work 40% above what they expect
What
to
theory
be
says.
the upper limit. Yes.
Okay.
And that's the other thing, and that's the other difference, is that we aren't doing the science. The science is already known. As engineers, we're applying science. So we don't have to prove the science, but we do need to prove that our design is
This
correct.
explains so much about my childhood. You have no idea. I would do things or just like go off on my way and try to figure it out as I go along. And I'll be like, Dad, it's okay. I've done it before. Or, Dad, it's okay. I've thought about all of these other things. And he comes
Or,
back
Dad,
with, well, you need evidence.
what could go wrong, Harry? What could go wrong?
And
I'll figure it out.
I'm sure that we could spend the rest of this episode having this discussion, but I don't know about you, Harry. I don't really want to go over this again.
No, it is all good. I was just
I know the listeners.
Okay,
I'm sure the listeners are fascinated by this topic, and the back and forth between science and engineering.
Well, I need to say that the some of us learned about redundancy watching NASA, and others learned about redundancy in Mad Magazine or somewhere with the Department of Redundancy Department. I think that was a thing.
Yeah, there was. I remember
that's
Mad
where
Magazine.
We learned. Yeah, that's where something
Okay.
like that. Okay.
All right. So Artemis is basically, and this gets to where we just were, and it is Artemis is planning to land on the moon on their third flight. So unlike Apollo, that actually took like 5 or 6 to do it, Artemis is planning on doing it on the third flight. And in fact, they're planning on the second flight to have humans aboard. Okay, Artemis 2 is going to have a crew. The crew was announced spring last year to great fanfare. And then just recently, NASA announced that, and at that time when they made that announcement, the Artemis 2 flight was planned for November of this year. But in January, NASA had to recognize reality and actually admit to it, to significantly less fanfare. Instead of a video thing on their NASA TV channel, it was just a teleconference that not as many people listened to. And basically there were 3 things that they cited, 3 main technical issues that they cited. One was the heat shield issue that was first identified after the return of Artemis 1 from lunar orbit. The heat shield behaved slightly differently than they had expected, and there were some parts of little pockets of the heat shield that were liberated during reentry. Liberated is a fancy way of saying
I love that word.
They came off the spacecraft, and that's unexpected behavior and not good behavior. So they're still investigating that, as it turns out, and they apparently are looking to have a root cause this spring. So that'll be like a year and a half after they first identified it. So I don't know any more about the analysis than that, but it does seem like that's a really long time to do that analysis. But it's hard to say. There's another apparently issue that's cropped up related to the abort system and the stresses that a abort would cause on some of the batteries in the Orion spacecraft. The structure of the spacecraft itself can handle the G load that an abort would cause, but apparently some of the batteries aren't rated for that, and they
So
apparently
they would catch fire, or
bad things happen to them. I don't know. I
they would bad things.
I didn't hear exactly
That's fair.
what.
Okay.
But and the third thing, and this is the actual quote, as we like to say, long pole in the tent. This one is the apparently there's a problem with motor valve circuitry on multiple of the electronics boxes that use the same circuitry that they identified as having a design flaw. And one of the boxes includes the carbon dioxide scrubber, which is absolutely needed for a crew because, in that small spacecraft, you need to be able to scrub the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and return it to oxygen. And so that's kind of a big deal. NASA phrased this as a delay due to crew safety. I feel that's a little disingenuous because it really is. The thing is, they chose to delay developing certain parts of the spacecraft because they didn't have the money. And for example, they didn't have a crew on Artemis 1, so they didn't need it. So they didn't develop the environmental control system until now they need it, and now there's a problem. And so is that crew safety or is that a management failure? Anyways, it's good they're going to fix it before they fly, and it's good they've acknowledged that it's going to take them a while. They did also announce when they announced this delay that Artemis 3, which is the mission to land on the moon, is going to be delayed as well, and it will now be no earlier than September of 2026, since Artemis 2 is now planned for September of 2025. And going back to Harry's question about what's needed to get to that moon landing, much less the mission to Mars, SpaceX needs to develop multiple Starship variants, including the lunar lander, a tanker, and a propellant depot. They have to demonstrate propellant transfer between their tankers and their propellant depot, and between the depot and the lander version. They need to do a demonstration landing on the moon without crew. And it will take, currently the thinking is it's going to be 10 or more tanker flights will be needed to fly the lunar mission, so to fly the lunar lander. So they have to be able to launch 10 tankers or more, as many as 18, I've heard, between 10 and 18, to fuel up the lander in a short amount of time before that fluid boils off because it's cryogenic, and then go to the moon, demonstrate the landing, and then demonstrate launching back off of the moon from a undeveloped landing site. In other words, it doesn't have a nice fancy landing pad because they're just landing on the moon, and they're landing on the moon, and it's going to be whatever it is. Yeah, it can be a little bumpy there. So there's a lot there, and a lot of things have to happen. And the idea that that's going to all be ready by September of 2026, basically 2.5 years from now. Yeah, I'm skeptical, but we'll see. SpaceX has been able to make amazing progress in short amounts of time. They're really good at that. So we'll see how they go.
Well, I'm skeptical too, right? I mean, anything thinking person about this is like, well, this is a really hard project. But you know what's the opposite of skeptical? What is inspiring to me,
A
or what is
veritable?
what
Truthful?
sticks out to me is that there's a plan. We kind of know what we have to do. None of those things in themselves are necessarily things that haven't been done before. I mean, yeah, we're doing them in space and we're doing them moving really fast and we're on the moon. I mean, yeah, right. But like you said, the science has been shown, right? They're not inventing new science. Don't have to make new fuels. These are all standard kinds of things. And it's a matter of, writing some code to make sure we get the scrubber going right, making sure that technology is properly implemented. And, it might not be 2.5 years, it could be 5, could be 10. But if they're focused on doing it, it's going to get done.
Yes. My skepticism isn't because it's not possible. My skepticism is that in 2.5 years, I'm skeptical that they will be ready to land people on the moon with this
probably,
arrangement.
especially in a safe manner, right?
In a safe manner. And again,
even if you're ready for getting those systems, then
after
what else
only
you forget?
flying one Artemis 2 with crew on board, and then flying a uncrewed test landing mission. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to all of it. I can't wait to watch it. I can't wait to come here to the Buff and talk about it. But it'll be interesting as it goes.
Well, that's great, Bob. That was a wonderful summary, and you did that all like extemporaneously. This is great. There's one other thing we need to talk about, and what's coming up in April here has nothing to do with Artemis, nothing to do with Super Heavy. And what is that big event, Bob?
That is the total solar eclipse that's coming 2 months actually from today as we record this.
Oh, that's right.
On April 8th, 2024, there will be a total solar eclipse that will cross Mexico, the United States, and head off into Canada.
And it will go right over my house.
And you are actually within the path of the total solar. Your house is within the path of the total solar eclipse
by design,
which is why you can expect me to come visit.
Yes,
and that the weekend before. and that actually speaks to the thing is, I've been to several to view several total eclipses. I attempted to do 3. I've seen 2. One was unsuccessful due to clouds, and that's the thing. In order to see a total solar eclipse, it needs to not be cloudy. And April is pretty iffy across most of the United States, at least from a history point of view. How many, what's the cloud cover, average cloud cover, whatever the right statistical term is, over the course of April, we're looking at some tough odds. We're looking at anywhere from 50-50 to 1 in 3.
So you're saying there's a chance?
Yes, there's a chance, and there's enough of a chance that you can be sure that I intend to be somewhere within the shadow of the moon's shadow on April 8th. Now, whether I will be looking up at the beautiful, as we've described it before in great detail in a previous episode, the sun's corona as the sun's bright surface is covered by the moon, remains to be seen. And that speaks to actually one of the things we should talk about, which is that the weather, we really won't start to get a good idea of where it's going to be clear or where we have a chance of seeing it until like 10 days out. So, right around the end of March. And then by, 5 days out, the forecasts these nowadays, if I can say that, are pretty darn good. And so we should have a pretty good idea by then where we want to be to see the eclipse. So there's not too much to do between now and then, except worry about the weather, which does no good, or make sure we're prepared, which involves getting some safe eclipse viewers to view the partial phases of the eclipse. Because
now, Bob, where would we get such things as those?
Well, as we've discussed before, the sun, when it's only partly covered by the moon, is just as bright as it is when it's not covered by the moon. The part that's not covered is still just as bright. And so we don't want to look at it with our eyes because we can harm our vision, and that would be bad. So what you want to do is you want to go to either the nasa.gov and find their eclipse page for this total eclipse, or go to eclipse.aas.org, which is the American Astronomical Society, who has a really nice webpage about the eclipse and has a separate page that's about eclipse viewing safety and safe filters. Don't go to Amazon. Don't search go to some random low cost. Go to the AAS website and find a reputable vendor. And one I actually recommend that I've used and I bought from them for my own solar filters for my telescope is Thousand Oaks Optical, which I had previously said is in California, but it's actually in Arizona. So Thousand Oaks Optical is one of the vendors listed on the American Astronomical
and
Society.
we will provide links to those in the show notes, so you will be able to just
click and go.
Click the thing, go there, and get your things so you're ready. And you can use those to look at the sun even when there's not an eclipse.
Yes,
if you would like to do that sort of thing.
And as we are moving in the next few years towards maximum solar activity, there will be visible sunspots that you will be able to see with your protected eyes using your eclipse viewers. You'll be able to actually see those sunspots.
Very cool.
Yes.
All right, yeah. Bob, I think we've covered at least the general outline of what we sought to cover today.
Not necessarily in a straight line, but
not in a straight line, but I think we covered all the things I set out to cover. So I'm happy.
Well, no, it was great. And once again, Bob, we are eternally grateful and just overjoyed to have you here as one of the buff big brain smart heads. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, you're absolutely welcome. And as you know, I always enjoy coming here and talking with you guys about whatever topic we decide we want to talk about.
Excellent. Yeah. Bob, I appreciate it. It's always good talking to you. For the listeners out there, if you have any space-related, rocket-related, astronomical-related questions, send them into the buff. We'll answer them. If we can't answer them, which we usually can't, we'll forward all of them to Bob, and he'll come back on for another show. In the meantime, we remind you all to seek the good, live virtuously, and flourish, and enjoy the adventure of life.